Hi, and welcome back to Composition, Color, and Light. Today's module is going to be covering understanding the aspects of color, and we're going to be covering three things, basic things today. We're going to look at those four aspects of color and define them, review how to put contrast and value to work, which is what we worked on in our last module, and thirdly, we're going to work on what exactly is hue and how to select your hues and color schemes for your paintings. I want to remind people of a few of those Hoffman quotes that I've used before because they're just so important to understanding how to use color in painting. In nature, light creates the color. In the picture or painting, color creates the light. So the more we begin to understand those four aspects of color, the more control we have over the sense of space and light in a painting. Also remember that it's not the form that dictates the color, but the color that brings out the form. And what Hoffman meant by that was that you need to paint the colors you see, not the objects. We're going to delve into that more as we move through Module 4 and 5, working on moving beyond simply painting objects to painting spots of color that, when they're connected, create the illusion of form or objects. Remember that the approach to color that we're working with is moving from local color, which is the physical innate color of the object, to optical color, which is the color that we see or perceive with our eyes. So we're moving away from the inherent color and using the color mixed with white or black to lighten or darken it, to using optical or perceptual color, which is the color that our eye sees and sometimes our brain rejects. So remember that lizard brain that we're trying to silence and to move into the background, and how we're trying to connect our eye directly with our brain so our perceptions, what our eye sees, match what we interpret it to be. So remember that we're working on moving beyond simply studying color theory, because studying theory in a book does not necessarily give you an understanding of how to apply color when you're dealing with paint. Pigments are not pure, so you need to understand how those things work in order to be able to apply them in the real world with real paint. We are going to cover a very small amount of color theory today because there's just a basic understanding of the relationships of hues that we need to go over. And then we're going to leave the theory behind and work mainly on understanding color and color schemes through the way that we work with the paint itself. So today's lesson has just about the only element of color theory that we're going to have through the whole course. So remember that color is defined by four aspects. We went over this in Module 1 as we looked at composition. So if you need to, go back and replay that first video on composition, and it'll refresh your memory on the four aspects of color. We're going to go over the definitions again briefly today. Value is the lightness or darkness of a color. Hue is the position of the color on the spectrum or the color wheel. Think of it as just the color's name. Intensity is the brightness or dullness of a color, and temperature is the warmth or coolness of a color. We've gone over value in the last module. This module focuses primarily on hue, and then in the next two modules, we'll spend an entire module each on those last two aspects of color. So we're going to go into each one in a fairly good bit of depth. So just a quick review of value, and the main thing that we were working on with value was to use a full range of values from dark to light, to think about mixing 3 values of each main color that you're using, and to avoid lightening with white and darkening with black. Remember to instead lighten your colors with an equally intense lighter hue and darken with an equally intense darker hue. When you do that, you maintain the intensities of the colors that you're working with. So do not lighten colors with white or darken them with black. In fact, remember I said hide that black from yourself once we start working with color, because you'll be tempted to use it and it will dull your colors right on down. So we're going to leave it alone. There are exceptions to those rules. Lightening colors with white is important when you're working with dye colors like the blues and the naphthol crimson and the Indian yellow, because they're dye colors, they're transparent, and you can lighten them with white and they will actually appear more intense up to a certain point. So remember that almost all of the rules that we talk about are rules that have exceptions. And this is one reason I don't think that color theory is the way to go to really understand how to use color in painting. You can come back to color theory after you understand the basics and it makes more sense. But if you approach learning color with the theory first and then the mixing understanding, it's very, very, very confusing. So for right now, remember not to lighten colors with white unless you're working with the blues, Indian yellow, or the crimson. So there are 4 colors that we've got on our palette that you can add white to lighten. And those are the 2 blues, the crimson, and the Indian yellow. On the others, try to leave it out. Try to avoid using white as much as possible. You can add it back in a little bit more later, but not right now. So remember, we looked at these examples before of how to lighten your colors with an equally intense lighter hue. On the left, you have the cinnabar green that was lightened with Indian yellow. On the right, you have a Montserrat orange that was also lightened with Indian yellow. So you can lighten colors with an equally intense lighter hue, and they'll maintain their intensity and their richness. Same thing with the darker colors. The terre verte on the left was darkened with a violet dioxazine purple that made it go very, very dark, almost black, but there's still enough of a hint of color there to maintain the richness of the color and the intensity. So as we move into hue, I want you to think about exactly what hue is. Hue is, in simplest terms, the color's name. It also refers to the color's position on the spectrum. We all studied the spectral names when we were in high school and learned the Roy G. Bibb mnemonics so that you could remember the positions. So the position of a color on the spectrum determines how we perceive it with our eyes. So in its simplest terms, hue is the position of the color on the spectrum. And we can look at it also as the position of the color on the color wheel. So the image here is an image of a mixed color wheel. And the color wheel has been mixed from the double primary palette that we're going to be using. And we'll move in and look closer at that throughout the rest of this module. But for the moment, think about the way you can break those colors down. Primary colors are blue, red, and yellow. We don't have exactly pure blues, exactly pure reds, and exactly pure yellows. That's why we have the need for the double primary palette. But those are the basic colors from which you can mix everything else. When you use the double primary palette, that theory turns into reality. So primary colors are those 3 basic colors. And then when you mix 2 primaries together, you get secondaries. So a mixture of yellow and red creates orange, red and blue creates purple or violet, blue and yellow make green. Those secondary colors become very important in creating a rich palette. When you mix a secondary and a primary together, you get what's known as a tertiary. A tertiary, it's easy to pick out by looking at the color name. So you have yellow orange, red orange, and that should be red violet down there. I just noticed a typo. Blue violet, blue green, and yellow green. They're hyphenated and they have the primary name in front always. That's a convention. And then the secondary color afterwards. So it goes primary, secondary in the mixture. There are other terms that go further out. I don't think you really need to know those. And in fact, if you forget what tertiary means, that's fine. Just remember that the tertiary colors, those yellow greens, yellow oranges, are mixtures of primaries and secondaries. When we look at those colors, they have certain relationships. So when you look at the colors on the color wheel, that wheel can help define certain relationships. Understanding a couple of the basic relationships really helps in thinking about color schemes. So complementary colors are the first relationships that we're going to look at. Complementary colors are those that are directly across from each other on the color wheel. So some common pairings are things like red and green, yellow and purple, blue and orange, blue-green and red-orange. So they're directly across from each other on the color wheel. The relationships that they have are based on the fact that if you have a pair of complementary colors, you have portions of all three primaries present. Because look at those pairs again closely and you'll notice that you have a primary and a secondary in each pair. When you have portions of all of the primaries present, when they're sitting next to each other, they'll intensify each other. So if you sit red down next to green, it's going to look super rich and super intense. Think back, those of you who are old enough to remember the pop art, psychedelic art of the late 60s and early 70s. Those vibrating colors came from the juxtapositions of complementary colors. If you mix those colors instead of juxtaposing them, what you get is known as mud. But that's also a great neutral. So you can use complementary colors to mix really wonderful neutral colors that are going to be much, much richer than any browns or grays that you squeeze out of a tube. So to me, that's one of the most important things to understand about complementary colors is that in mixing colors, when you want to make a neutral, combine complements or close complements together and they'll neutralize each other. They'll somewhat cancel each other out so that you can get a rich gray or brown. Analogous colors, that's another color relationship that's important to understand. Analogous colors are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And their special relationship comes from having a common underlying color. So they are extremely harmonious. They really like each other a lot because they share a common parent. So if you think about blue, blue-green, and green, they all three share the common parent, blue. So if you use them together, they're going to very, very closely relate and they'll speak to each other in a way that colors that are opposite to each other will not. So the two relationships that I want you to think about as we're working with color are the complementary colors and the analogous colors. So colors that are opposite to each other and colors that are next to each other. They'll create completely different feelings in a painting. So to achieve a full range of colors as we mix, we're going to use a double primary palette. So if you look back at the supply list for the course, you'll have noticed that there are 2 blues, 2 reds, and 2 yellows on the list, whether you're working in oils or acrylics. Those color names can shift from brand to brand, but basically these fill out the entire spectral range so that we can mix a full range of colors. You want to have a warm and a cool of each of the three primaries in order to be able to mix that full range. So ultramarine blue is the warmer of the two blues. Phthalo blue is the cooler. Naphthol red is the warmer, and naphthol crimson is the cooler. Indian yellow is the slightly warmer. Yellow ochre is the slightly cooler. They're pretty closely related, much more so than the other two. And then we have titanium white to use as a lightening agent in those dye colors. Remember that the blues and the crimson and the Indian yellow are dye colors. So we can add some white to those. And obviously, if you're painting the landscape, there are areas that need to be lighter than others, like the sky, and you cannot add yellow to the sky to lighten it up. That's going to look odd. So because that's a dye color that we're using there, you can use the white to lighten that color. So next we're going to look at those steps in creating that full range of colors. So here is that palette that we just talked about laid out on a color wheel. When you look at the colors that are labeled number 1, we have red, blue, and yellow. And I have labeled warm red, warm blue, warm yellow, and cool yellow. So we have the two primary colors for each one. So at the top level, we have the primaries. Then when you mix the two primaries together, you get the secondaries. When you mix the two, a secondary and a primary together, you get the tertiaries. We're going to go through this entire mixing exercise as our demo for this module. So this is going to become so much clearer and easier to understand once we go through and mix these colors, and then you understand how you can create them on your own from that double primary palette. It doesn't mean you can't use convenience colors later. I think once you understand how to mix them, it's fine to use convenience colors, but you need to know how to mix them so that you really understand how colors relate. So in planning your hues and your color scheme, the first step is going to be to make a thumbnail study. So you need to make that study. I'm going to harp on thumbnail studies and notans a lot throughout the course. And one of the reasons that that thumbnail becomes incredibly important when you're planning your colors is it's going to help you identify your color scheme. Remember way back at the beginning of the course, I said that you're not going to have to memorize all of those different color schemes that people talk about. So you don't need to know double split complements. You don't need to know triadic. Those become actually, I think, hindrances rather than helps when you're first starting to work with color. If you work from a thumbnail study, you can work it out without having to know what those color schemes are. So make that thumbnail study and then identify one color per large shape. And that is going to be most easy to do once you've done that thumbnail study and look back at the photograph. So that means that if you've got a thumbnail study that has 5 shapes, you could have up to 5 main colors. If you have 7 shapes, you could have up to 7 main colors. And I'm going to show you how I identified the main colors for this particular painting. So we've looked at this one several times before. This is the photograph of the landscape that I was working from. And you can see a variety of different colors here. And remember that our eye loves to trick us about what we're looking at. In order to see that super clearly, I would again strongly recommend that you use a viewfinder, that you create a spot color viewfinder by taking a 3 to 4 inch square of mat board and a hole punch. Scoot the hole punch up as far as you can onto the mat board and punch a hole through it. Look through that viewfinder at the subject, whether it's landscape, figure, still life, whatever, or a photograph and identify the color, the main color that you see in that particular area of the composition. So I've done that here using the computer. So in the background, you can see a very, very light grayscale version of the photograph. And on top of the photograph, I've superimposed spots of color that helped me identify which colors to use in my final painting. So you can see both the hue and the value relationships there. And when you look at this and squint your eyes, you can tell that the lightest parts of the painting or the composition are going to be the sky and the grass in that field where the light is striking. So that's the overall color for those individual masked shapes from the thumbnail. Identify one color per large shape. Then you're going to mix those colors. So in the case of this particular composition, if you count the colors, we've got exactly 7 colors. There's 7 almost different distinct colors, although there are 2 that are pretty close together on the right-hand side. So you might have 5, you might have 7. Please don't mix more than mix more than 7. Keep those shapes and those basic colors to 5 to 7. Remember the mantra, 3 to 5 values, 5 to 7 shapes. When you get to working in color, no more than 7 basic colors per composition, because you're going to use that thumbnail to help you pick out which colors to mix. Once you've selected the colors, then mix a light and a dark of each of those colors. A light and a dark of each of those colors. So if I decide that those 2 on the far right-hand side are really close, and I'm going to use 6 main colors here, once I have mixed a light and a dark of each of those colors, then I'm going to have 18 colors, because I'm going to have 3 of each. I'm going to have the main color, and I'm going to have a light and a dark of each one. And you can see that on the palette here. So I've actually mixed a few more than I needed, but I've mixed a light and a dark of each of the main colors. So let's look back over what we've covered today. We've looked at the 4 aspects of color, and they were value, hue, intensity, and temperature. We've reviewed how to put contrast and value to work for you. Remember, you want to have a full range of values, and you want to avoid using white and black and mixing your values as you paint. We've looked at what hue is and how to select your hues and color schemes. So hue is the color's spectral position. It's where the color is on the color wheel. Remember, you can think of it as the color name. And how to select the hues for your color scheme. 1 color per one of the main areas in your thumbnail. So our next demo and exercise is going to be looking at how to mix that double primary color wheel. So that will be coming up next, and you will need your paints when you get going on that, and we'll be using some colors. So happy painting. Look below and you'll see a short exercise for you to work through before you get to the color mixing exercise.